Hi, my name is EJ Massa. Look, I don't know a thing about TikTok, but I know a thing or two about CRT televisions.
Apparently, it's all the rage to put little TVs in your kitchen.
And I thought, wow, I can finally be hip since I'm absolutely swimming in little TVs. So, what if I do my own EJ spin on the kitchen TV concept? It's the holidays, I'll be doing lots of baking and cooking in the kitchen, so wouldn't it be nice if I load up the RGB-pi I reviewed for a video with a whole playlist of holiday classics for me to enjoy while I do my Christmas activities?
The RGB-pi that I covered in that video is no longer being made, and the creator is making the RGB-pi 2 adapter, which will also have a media player through the operating system Replay OS.
But since it's not out yet, I can't do a video on it, but you can bet I'll cover it when it does.
In case you're confused about what the RGB-pi is, or at least with the first version, it was a cable that connected to the pins of a Raspberry Pi and combined with the RGB-pi operating system, outputted 240p through RGB SCART to your favorite television. At least one that has an RGB SCART input.
It worked really well, and I think it'll be great for my kitchen CRT media center.
Which brings me to this little guy, a little RCA TV that is unfortunately RF only, but fortunately, it can be RGB modded according to CRT database.
For those of you who don't know what RGB modding means, it just means the TV's internal chips have the potential to receive a more high quality signal, split into red, green, and blue. But for cost-cutting reasons or specific markets, they just never added those inputs in. So we'll modify the TV to add those inputs and get a higher quality picture.
And this white TV is really nice, and it doesn't seem to be suffering from the yellowing plastic that plagues a lot of these white kitchen TVs.
I don't know why, but having specifically a white CRT feels appropriate for a kitchen TV, but it makes sense, you know? Maybe because fridges are white. Well, mine is stainless steel, but when I picture a cartoon fridge in my head, you can bet it's white.
According to this old Best Buy ad about this RCA TV, Mom will love watching her favorite shows in the kitchen, and she'll have all her counter space to work with.
Wow, I must be a mom, because I'm sold.
And because this TV is RF only, it can be found for slightly cheaper than the little Sony TVs, which go for over $200. This one was only $60, still a lot, but it was in excellent condition. I played a little Mega Man 2, and the tube is bright, looks fairly sharp, the colors pop. The only problem is the RF output on the NES has terrible dot crawl, jail bars, and ghosting with some of the sprites. You can see in Woodman's stage here the trees shimmer and dance with the dot crawl.
So not only will adding an RGB SCART fix this, it will allow us to hook up our RGB-pi system to play all of our movies and holiday-themed video games. Now, I could add every Christmas movie ever on the Raspberry Pi, but I thought it would be more fun to put a smaller library with fewer choices to avoid the Netflix decision paralysis, kind of like when Retro Game Core only put 5 games on a handheld.
So I went to the library with my boys to pick out holiday DVDs. Noah was helping me and pointed out a few like Rudolph, a classic. He specifically was interested in the Muppet Christmas Carol and was carrying it around like a precious totem. We also picked up the Chuck Jones, How the Grinch Stole Christmas. I specifically remember an elementary school teacher who was probably hungover, and she wheeled out the cart with a CRT on it and put on the classic Grinch cartoon on VHS, and I've been in love with the special ever since. The Dr. Seuss Museum is also nearby, so it's a bit of a local favorite as well. Of course, I had to grab Charlie Brown Christmas, and I haven't seen Frosty the Snowman since I was a kid, but I remember liking it quite a bit when it appeared on TV. There was something so refreshing about physically going to a place and picking out movies.
And the best part is it's completely free. Or I mean, I pay taxes and it gets funded through those taxes that I pay, I guess. So I might as well use it.
However, I broke my own rules and I bought a couple DVDs because they had to be in my holiday playlist. I got the full screen version of Christmas Vacation. I actually already own the widescreen version, but when I was a kid, we watched the Formed to fit your screen version, so that's the one I'm choosing to put on this little console. Christmas Vacation is not only one of my favorite Christmas movies, but it's probably one of the best comedies of all time. My other purchase was the full screen version of A Christmas Story.
A fun fact about this one, it took me decades to actually watch this in proper order. TNT used to play Christmas Story on repeat for 24 hours on Christmas Eve. I would catch a scene here or there, and I never quite knew what was the end of the movie or what was the beginning until I rented it on DVD one year, and I watched it in the proper order. And to this day, I'm not quite sure which scene happens where in the movie, and, because many of the scenes are just really funny standalone vignettes.
I got out my external Blu-ray drive because computers don't have CD drives anymore. I guess they haven't really had them for a decade. And used Make MKV to make a backup of the video and Handbrake to convert it to MP4 so the RGB-pi can play it. You can also get a plug-in for Handbrake to just rip it straight from the DVD to MP4. Then I SSH'd into the RGB-pi and dragged all my Christmas movies into the Kodi Media folder. If you want a more in-depth look at how I set up my RGB-pi, please check out the video with all the steps.
And since the RGB-pi is mostly a video game playing device, I decided to put a bunch of Christmas-themed retro games and ROM hacks on it. I asked for recommendations on the Red Cow Discord, and I also checked out lists like the SNES Drunk's Christmas ROM hack episode.
I used romhacking.net to not only find the ROM hacks, but I also used the utility linked on the website to upload the vanilla ROM and then apply the ROM hack patch. In addition, I utilized Super Mario World Central to find ROM hacks, and also they have a similar tool to apply patches, and it makes it really easy. And here's the list I came up with. For non-ROM hacks, I have Snow Brothers and Batman Returns for the NES, which, that movie takes place around Christmas. Is a very Christmassy movie. For Super Mario World ROM hacks, I have Mario World Merry Mountain Christmas Adventure, which came highly recommended from Frankie. I have Super Mario World Winter's Delight, Mario Saves Christmas 2021, A Haunted Christmas, and Super Mario World Christmas Edition. For NES ROM hacks, specifically for the original Super Mario Bros., I have Toad's Christmas Adventure and the sequel, Toadette's Christmas Adventure, and Luigi and the Christmas Quest. To mix it up, I have a couple Metroid ROM hacks, Super Metroid Snow Globe, and Spooky Mission 2, The Nightmare Before Christmas, which is probably more of a Halloween game, but it has Christmas in the title, so it still counts. I have Sonic's Christmas 2011 and Sonic 2 Christmas Edition for the Genesis, and finally, for something completely different, a Christmas-themed Earthbound ROM hack called Holiday Hex. And here's the final list. Plenty of holiday-themed retro gaming to brighten up the darkest days of the year, and Christmas movies to spread some holiday cheer. I made sure to go into the RGB-pi menu and favorite all of the Christmas games so that they would be easy to quickly access as soon as I turned on the system.
Now it's time to embrace my inner Bjork and open this guy up and experience Christmas in the city inside the television, and hopefully also put an RGB SCART input into it.
Hello, it is Christmas time and I'm sitting here by my TV. This is what it looks like. This looks like a city, like a little model of a city.
So as I said, CRT Database said that this can be modded, and it said that they used the service manual for the TX808 chassis 13-inch because they said it was close enough to follow to perform the mod. And it just so happens that on Sunthar's website, which is a good resource for CRT RGB mods, he has a guide for TX808 chassis ones, so I figured it would be close enough to follow the details in that guide. I started off making the RGB SCART connector. I actually had a few boards left over from when I printed some for my Sony 32-inch RGB mod. Sunthar has newer versions of the board on his website, but I figured these should still work out. You can even buy kits on his website with these boards and components. I was following the diagram for this, which is specific for this TV on Sunthar's website. Although it didn't have a guide, it just links to this other TX808 chassis RCA TV, which should be similar. But according to that diagram, I put a 180 ohm resistor in R1, R2, and the R3 slots on the input board. Then I put 820 ohm resistors in R4, R5, and the R6 slots. R7 and R8, which are the audio inputs, I put 1K ohm resistors. And for the blanking signal input, which is R11, the schematic said 1K ohms, but the schematic for the other chassis, which is similar, said 1.5K ohms. And I originally put a 1K ohm in there, but then I switched it to the 1.5K ohm later based on the other schematic because I wasn't sure which one was quite right. And it's near Christmas. I've had a few too many eggnogs. I didn't feel like doing calculations, and spoiler alert, the 1.5K ohm resistor worked just fine. And then in the D9 slot, I added the 1N4148 diode, making sure it's in the correct direction, which you can tell by the location of the little black line on one side of it. Soldered all those in and clipped the leads. I added the female side of the 10-pin connector to the correct side. You can tell what direction it goes in because there's this little groove in the picture, and that lines up with the groove on the connector. Soldered that into place, and then I soldered the 90-degree angle SCART connector to the other side. And there we go, a completed connector. Next, we'll need to crack open the TV itself. I, of course, unplugged the TV, and the typical warning, always be careful when opening or doing any work on a CRT television. I took out the 4 screws holding the back on and carefully removed it. I disconnected this green wire, this blue and brown wire connector here, which it needs some gentle prying with a tiny tool. Be very gentle though, don't force it. This connector near the flyback came off after lifting the lever on it. I gently wiggled the neck board off, and then I took a screwdriver with a cable attached to ground and I stuck it under the anode cap just to make sure it was discharged. Then I pulled off that suction cup thing. That's pretty difficult to do because there's a little clamp that needs to be pinched to take out that connector from the hole in the tube. That's pretty tough to do. Finally, I unscrewed this black ground wire from the speaker. This allowed me to pull out the board just enough to work on it. Looking at the schematic, I'll need to add some diodes after these resistors. This will help lessen interference. And here they are on the board, RR38, 39, 40, and 41. I used my Haka solder sucker to loosen them up from the other side of the board. Sometimes you have to add fresh solder and flux to help that old solder flow away from the vias. I lifted the resistors from the board and added the diodes, and I double checked that the black lines were facing the correct direction. Then I soldered the diodes into place, cutting off the excess leads. Soldered the other side of the diodes into the vias from the other side of the board, and again, trimmed the excess leads. I forgot to film this, but I need to remove the following resistors: RR535, 536, and 537. These were the locations of the resistors on the board, and I removed them by holding the little components with a pair of tweezers and then heating each side back and forth until they popped off. So I took my ribbon cable that I have, similar to the one you'd get in Sunthar's kit, and I fed it through these holes in the back. You got the red, green, blue, and brown blanking wires through one hole, and the yellow sync wire, purple and black ground wires, and the white and gray audio wires through this other hole. The orange wire goes unused. We'll solder the blue, green, red, and brown blanking wires to the diodes that we just installed. They go in this order. Now here's a little diversion, because while the 9-inch TV's board is very similar to the 13-inch board, whose guide I'm following, it's not exactly the same because I soldered the ground, composite, and audio wires to this location here, which is the same as the picture in the guide for the 13-inch RCA TV. But it must not connect to the same places because when I tested it, there was no sound and the sync was messed up, which tells me the jungle chip isn't getting sound or composite sync. There isn't a service manual for the 9-inch, so I checked the service manual for the 13-inch and looked at the inputs of the jungle chip, and it seems like I need to connect the audio to pin 53, which says TV audio, and pin 37, which says TV video, and that'll be our composite sync. And you can see in this diagram, there's the red, green, blue, and blanking inputs. Those pins, they're over here. We already connected those. So I just decided to cut off the audio and video from the RF tuner by first removing the capacitor CV30 and soldering both audio wires, this is a mono TV after all, to the via closest to pin 53. And then I looked at the schematic and decided to remove RI528, 532 and CI 525, which are these components on the board. And then I inserted the composite wire at the leg B of TI-21, that transistor. If I had more time, Christmas is coming, the goose is getting fat, I'm running out of time, I'd probably add a switch so that I could preserve the RF input, kind of like this modded one on CRT database, but I'm gonna be real. I'm never using RF input on this TV. I just won't. I did leave the purple and black ground wires on the initial pad that I soldered to begin with, and you could also just solder them to any ground on the board. I crimped the other side of the ribbon cable with the male 10-pin connector, and I connected that 10-pin connector into the SCART input we made earlier, and now it's time to put everything back together and test for real. And there it goes. The sync and audio work now. Man, I'm so impressed with how crisp and clear it looks. Audio sounds perfect, picture looks perfect. This is a huge, huge improvement over RF. So now that I know it works, it's time to do some surgery on the back and put in the SCART input. First, I had to plan exactly where it would go so it wouldn't hit any of the components inside the TV. I just hovered it inside and that seems good enough. I measured the exact location and used a pencil in a SCART template from console5.com to trace an outline of where it would be. Then I embraced my inner James Rolfe and I drilled through some tough 80s wood, or tough 2000s plastic in this case.
So for the first time ever, I had to drill a hole in it. Really tough 80s wood.
Sanded the edges and drilled a couple of holes for the screws that will hold the connector in. And finally, I used some nuts and screws to hold the input in place. Okay, it looks a little rough, but when I have time, I'll use that same Console 5 template to hide some of the jank, but that should work for now. Plug the SCART back in, place the back cover back on, and the mod was a success. It has a new RGB SCART input, and I can connect my RGB-pi and have the TV ready to play Christmas classics.
I almost guarantee not many people are doing that on TikTok.
And the image does look super colorful, detailed, and sharp. Way better than anything you'd get over RF, especially for video games. And there we go, an RCA TV for Red Cow Arcade.
This will look perfect, perched in my kitchen while we make mac and cheese and make merry. That's all I have for now. Until next time, bye.